Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for having me. Joseph put a pretty high level for my talk here now, and it's an absolute completely different topic. But I'll do my best to keep you entertained for another half an hour, even though we did not follow Joseph's first idea that we should take breaks. But maybe, I don't know, it's 7 o'clock, it's, what is it, 6 o'clock. So you already have a beer in your hand, I hope, and the pizza will come a little bit later. Anyway, a quick word about me. This is one way I look now, this is another way I look, and on the picture on the right there, that's third me. I have a technical background, developer by trade basically, co-founder of SuperText translation agency in Zurich, and I did build like pretty much our core system initially. Nowadays I have help and people that know that stuff better than me, which is a big advantage. If I have some time, I do like to work on cars. As my friends would think, it's maybe not the best idea, but I'll keep on trying. So a little bit of background before we dive in, how we even got this whole Azure and Microsoft stuff. A long time ago, as you can see from the picture, I looked a little bit different, and on the side there's my friend Reto. I was working in New York and we both had the same problem. We always had to send out Excel files and synchronize them by hand. It was just a big mess, and we figured, let's invent a synchronized Excel sheet. It kind of worked out. Okay, sorry, I messed this up. And at the time, I had a consulting job at a financial software company. I had Visual Studio installed from my job, and saw, okay, they have Visual Studio has web forms, you can build websites with that. So when we started this, was pure coincidence that we started with Microsoft, really just because that was what was installed on my laptop at the time. We used a dedicated server from Maximum ASP, Microsoft ASP.NET Web Forms, C#, and Reto ended up with Visual Basic. That was his part, so I think that was the last time he ever touched Visual Basic. Unfortunately, this idea with this synchronized Excel didn't work out. Reto moved on to Doodle afterwards. Doodle, I hope you guys all know. And then afterwards he started TestingTime, which is a really cool startup in Zurich, and they help find you test users. So if you have a new product or what, and you want to see if people actually understand how to use it, TestingTime can help you. I co-founded SuperText in 2005 and I became the CEO there. Just a quick word, SuperText is a translation agency. We have offices in Zurich, Berlin, and LA. Whatever you need translated, your website, your app, we can help you with that. But back to the topic. As I said, coincidence, Microsoft was installed in my laptop. So this shared Excel stuff was built on Microsoft, and because I had, that was there, we continued on that track for SuperText. Originally, I was actually more of a Java programmer, so could have gone either way. We did use MySQL in the beginning, Maximum ASP as the host. Unfortunately, at that time, I didn't know about 9. Who knows where we would be nowadays if I would have met Tom a little bit earlier. And we had Fastmail. That was one of the first email providers that had IMAP. And soon after, Gmail came out with IMAP, but yeah, it was too late then. Over time, we switched MySQL to SQL Server, and the big move at the time was from having a dedicated server where you really just had like a physical box that was somewhere in a data center. When we moved to Azure, and because everything else was Microsoft already, we figured we might as well move Fastmail to Office 365. And with Office 365, we got Active Directory For those who are not in the Microsoft world, Active Directory is basically the central user administration and whatever, like all your users are stored in Active Directory with all their roles and what they can do and what not. Initially, I think it had quite a bad reputation, super complex, but luckily for us, with Office 365 and with Azure, the administration has been quite easy and nice. So for my experience with it, it's been pretty good. With that said, this is Azure, Kubernetes, and whatever talk. Personally, I really don't know much about Amazon Web Services or the Google Cloud, so I don't really have much of a comparison. What I can tell you is how we deal with Azure, things that are great, things that are not so great, or since the call was called Zonk, it's more of the focus of the stuff that is a bit on the complicated side. One of the cool things that I want to start with user management, and that includes single sign-on, and this is basically the Active Directory again. Directory for free if you have Office 365, and maybe just for those who are not familiar with Office 365, Office 365 is pretty much the same thing as Google Cloud if you have email and docs and whatnot, with the advantage for some people, I think some people would say it's a horrible idea, but you do get the Office desktop tools with it. And so since we do have Active Directory, it's pretty much at the heart of what we do. We can use Active Directory for our own online management system that we've built. The one here on the left, we use it for our HR tool. We use it to log into SQL Server, use it for SQL Azure. SQL Server and SQL Azure is not quite the same thing. We use it for our Windows servers, for DevOps, and also to log into our laptops, cell phones, tablets, what have you. So really, pretty much our whole organization is controlled by Active Directory, and you don't need a massive IT team to set this up and control this. We are 10 people, most are developers, so they don't really take care of this. We have 2 people in support that kind of manage this, and we get some external help occasionally with that stuff. But that whole Active Directory story, I think, was for us quite a big benefit and pretty cool. But as usual, there are some carrots. We think, okay, we have this Active Directory. Turns out Active Directory and Azure Active Directory is not actually the same. So if you want to log in to a Windows server or a SQL server, then Azure Active Directory is not enough. You need an additional service that you have to configure. Azure Active Directory Domain Services, and it's by no means obvious how to configure this thing. We got it working with some external help, but for me, a bit of something I don't understand. If you build Active Directory in Azure, why can't you use this out of the box to connect to all existing SQL Server and whatever what you have from Microsoft? So that has been some Microsoft stuff I don't understand. Another real highlight, I think, from Azure and Microsoft is security nowadays. I know they had a really bad reputation, but if you have Azure and especially also Office 365, they do have different subscription levels. If you really want to get the whole security suite integrated, you need a pretty expensive subscription level. The one we have is E5, and that costs about $50 per user. But it's cool. So this page here is integrated, so you can run simulated attacks. For example, you can send out emails that have malware. You can send out phishing mails. You can send out programs that have viruses in them. Obviously, all things that don't do anything bad, but you can test how your users react if they actually get something like this. And it's quite interesting if you see and you send this out and then you see 50% of the people opened the file. So you would have a virus on your desktop now if this would have been for real. We haven't used it here yet. As you can see, 0 of the users have completed the training. And I hope not too many of my employees are watching this show, because we actually do want to try this out pretty soon. This is another dashboard that you get that gives you ideas, or it's not ideas, but recommendations on how you should configure your system. You can see our security score at the moment is not very high yet. We've really just started pushing our security into, let's hopefully, higher numbers. We are working on the ISO 27001 certification. So for that, I guess our secure score needs to be a little bit higher. But it gives you a list of all the stuff that you should configure or can configure, so that your security just so that your security is higher. If you would have to figure this out all by yourself, or just even know all the stuff that you can configure with Azure and with all these Microsoft services, if you're not a sysadmin, I think you're completely lost, and nobody in our company is a sysadmin. But with tools like this, makes it quite easy. This is an email we get for our SQL Server, for example. Also comes and says, hey, okay, there's security checks that your guys are failing. This is a development server, so it's not as bad, but still 19 failing checks. Maybe there is room for improvement. But the cool thing is you get these emails, and then you can go through all these recommendations, and maybe they make sense for you or not, because it's not everybody has the same situation, but you can work it down and try to make this as secure as possible, and you don't have to go through books and websites and whatever to find that stuff. And the first screen I showed was for Office 365. You basically have the same thing for Azure. Also gives you a massive list of all the things you could improve to get higher security score. One thing that I thought was pretty cool about Office 365 that I have not seen anywhere else is the combustion chamber. And it's basically a virtual machine, and all your emails get opened in a virtual machine. And if the email has an attachment, let's say it's a Word file, they open the Word file in that virtual machine, wait for a few minutes, and check if anything unusual happens on the virtual machine. And with that, you can actually catch viruses that nobody knows about it, just by trying out what happens. And this happens automatically. It delays the email delivery by a few minutes if there are attachments in there. Otherwise, makes almost no impact. But it has proven pretty valuable for us in the past, especially since we're a translation agency. We do get documents from clients all the time. And it's not the first time that we get documents from, or at least under the client's name, or from a client that got a virus and we caught it with this system, and otherwise likely we would have had it on our hard drive now. Now, a bit on the other side is our story with Kubernetes. It all started with basically setup. When we moved to Azure, we had a dedicated server, and the easiest way to migrate to Azure was getting a virtual machine, like a full virtual machine. You can log in, it's a Windows server, it has IIS, that's the web server. And initially we only had the more yellow things on the left side, our admin portals built with web forms. The customer, the freelancer portal was built with MVC, it's all .NET stuff, and the API. And those things were built with the traditional Microsoft .NET framework. And then came Microsoft .NET Core. And we started building our new stuff with .NET Core. And on IIS, running this stuff side by side wasn't a problem. But we really wanted to get rid of the whole Windows server and move to Azure App Services. First of all, so that we can script the whole setup process. Our Windows server or virtual machine was all set up manually. And with Azure App Services, you can basically, I don't know how it's called on Amazon, but I think it's called similar. But I think there you can just upload a jar file. That's it. Don't have to take care of a server, no updates, nothing. Security out of the box, scalability out of the box. Sounded great, exactly what we needed. But then it turns out you can't run ASP.NET Core and the old ASP.NET framework in the same app service. So if we wanted to do that, we had to do basically two, couldn't have run on the same website. And we said, okay, what can we do? Solution Containerized App Services, where you basically put your apps in Docker containers, and then you can just run multiple Docker containers side by side on the same app service. A little bit more complex in the setup, also more maintenance, because you do have to maintain your Docker container images and stuff. Got a working prototype, all already pretty optimistic and happy. But no, turns out these containerized app services weren't available in Switzerland. And one thing I forgot to mention, the whole thing why we do this exercise is also at the moment our server is in Dublin, because when we moved to Azure, there wasn't any Azure services in Switzerland, but now there are. And but containerized app services wasn't available, called Microsoft. When do you bring this to Switzerland? Nobody knew, there was no date. So not a dead end. And then I talked to Tom during one of our CTO meetups, which, by the way, I would recommend to any CTOs that are listening here. If there are any, join us. It's a pretty cool meeting every 3 months, Thursday morning. And so back to topic. Tom was all super optimistic about Kubernetes, that this will solve all your problems. And I figured, okay, that sounds cool. Let's give this a try. But I would have to say, I mean, just from far, it did look more complex from the setup. It's definitely a little more maintenance, and nobody at SuperText had any experience with Kubernetes. We did get there now. We have this prototype up and running, and it's running in Switzerland. But as usual, what happened is that Key Vault, and that's a Microsoft solution for secrets where you store your passwords and all that stuff, was not out of the box supported by the Kubernetes instance that run on Azure. Or at least not on the standard one. We had to upgrade to a different, sometimes of a higher, I don't know the name anymore. But yeah, not there by click. Turns out the one we have now, the Kubernetes version that runs on Azure doesn't support doesn't support Ingress. But they said, okay, there is a preview, you can use that one. We are trying that actually right now, but that's not up and running yet. And preview and Azure is always a bit of a tricky thing, because you never really know where it's going. So even with Kubernetes, our Swiss server dreams have not been completely achieved, but I think that's definitely where we stay and where we want to continue. But it looks great and easy in the beginning, and then once you go down to the details, it gets very tricky. Another thing that's a bit on the similar side with Azure is backups. For example, for virtual machines, you have backups. You can basically, it's one click, say I want the backup, you get the backup, you can say how many times, whatever. But then, like, okay, now maybe we should try to restore it. And you can restore it with a click. But the VM will not run on the same IP address anymore afterwards. And if you've set up your DNS, usually with an IP address, then you're toast. Oh no, you're not toast. You can reconfigure your DNS, but that might take hours until everything is restored, or like all the DNS addresses are updated. So it's really not just backup and something goes wrong, you click and your backup is back up and then your server runs again. You can do it with the same IP address, but it's quite a complex manual process. And then, for example, blob storage, that's just what we use to store all files and whatnot. There's just no backup option whatsoever. So we even looked for, there are a few commercial solutions out there, but they were kind of weird. So we actually had to build our own backup solution. And when we switched to the cloud years ago, having to build my own backup was really the last thing I had in mind. And I figured that should have been something that is solved if you move to a cloud solution. Another topic, innovation and documentation. The cool thing about Azure, they are really developing very fast. So compared to what was there years ago when we started to what is there now, it's actually really awesome. And all their services do change and improve very quickly. And I mean, the success from Azure, I think it's compared to, I think they almost caught up to Amazon, and they're definitely far ahead to Google, at least not in terms of, I know Tom is using Google, but not in terms of how much revenue they have. I think they're definitely up there and they really caught up. You get the latest version of everything, high performance, scalability, you have all that. Swiss Cloud, I think that's like a big advantage. I think Google has Swiss Cloud, but as far as I know, Amazon doesn't have yet. But on the negative side, for example, we used the SQL Server, or we wanted to use SQL Server when we moved to Azure, and then there was like, okay, Azure, what the native Azure solution is Azure SQL, but then there is still SQL Server, and then there is managed SQL, and you're like, what's the difference? And so it turns out they're all the same, but they're all a bit different. And then you have to figure out what is the right solution for you. At the moment, we are using Azure SQL, and in parallel, we're using SQL Server. But likely we'll try to move from SQL Server to managed SQL, but we'll see. And obviously, the problem that you have with something that develops so fast is whenever you're trying to use it and you're looking for documentation, the documentation you find is always out of date. And then you're fighting through the different documentation and blog posts and what you find to figure out how does this thing work. And it's a bit frustrating sometimes. And something that I would not have expected moving to the cloud is that you use a service and then they release a new service. So basically we use their virtual machines, and then they came out with like modern virtual machines. So they called the old one now classic virtual machines, but there's no upgrade path. What you have to do is pretty much start from scratch, set up your server new. There's no button, there's no scripts you can click to upgrade from the old one to the new one. And maybe this whole preview thing is, I don't know, they might have learned that from Google. Whenever you want to use something that's a bit on the cutting edge, then it's in preview and it changes and it's a bit just unstable. And what we learned with these containerized service, and I think a lot of other stuff, Azure does have data centers in, I don't know how many locations in the world, I think like 40 or 80, which is great, but every data center has a bit of a different set of services that they have, which makes the whole thing, again, pretty complicated when you want to have a data center, when you want to use multiple data centers, for example. And then the thing that happened to us more than once is we had our service or whatever, and they came out with a new version or with a new feature. And then, of course, that feature was not available on our service. And as I said, on top, upgrades were not possible. So you have to really go through the whole thing again. This is how our Azure SQL Server looks like, the configuration part. And you can see here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but like there's different levels of this SQL Server that you can rent. So there's basic, standard, premium, then there's general purpose, hyperscale, business critical. And with general purpose, for example, you can say provisioned or serverless, how many cores and data. And it's a real, like, you need a PhD to figure out what's the correct server for you. What's the difference between provisioned and serverless and basic and standard and general purpose? And I don't think we really figured it out. We usually try something and see, is it fast enough? Okay, no, maybe we'll switch to something else. It's always a bit of a guessing game. And then this is for a virtual machine. There's 48 different configuration options for your virtual machines that are available for these classic virtual machines, and then there's 84 other options that are not available. Which one is the right one for you? Maybe the price, you select one, but I don't know. Something simpler that you can just say how many cores you want, how many gigabytes, is maybe something that I would think is easier. Another typical Microsoft problem, I think, we tried to script our whole Kubernetes, or basically the setup process that we have now. And you can, it's awesome. You have like a PowerShell, or then that's a problem, the Azure CLI, where you can really script the whole setup process from start to beginning. But as always, there's two solutions, and no one really can tell you which one is better, which one you should use. And then you start using one. We decided Azure CLI, you can script 99% of the features, and then just a tiny last bit, oh no, that's not available in Azure SQL. Or you have to use PowerShell for that. Or if worst case, it's not available in anything and you have to do it manually. And again, like with this scripting stuff, most examples that we found were outdated. Yeah. So the final words, all in all, I think, and I'll note that I was a bit on the negative side here because of the title. I was talking about the Zonk of Azure. I think the whole thing is pretty cool if you are in the Microsoft world, as we are, from Office 365 and Active Directory, Visual Studio, C#, Windows Server, SQL Server. If you're on that side, the stuff works together and it's pretty powerful. It's nice, but it's a constant fight with version documentation and missing features. That's it from me for the moment. I'm not sure if there were some questions.
Currently, there are no questions. We'll see if we get some questions. Waiting a few seconds. So maybe Remy is also open for suggestions.
Yeah. No, I mean, we did think about switching, but we are so deep in the Microsoft ecosystem, I think it would be pretty painful process to switch from Microsoft to something else. As I said, I know this talk was a bit was more about the problems that we're facing, but all in all, I think they do have some really cool features, and whatever you need, it is there. Which and as I said, I don't really know Google Cloud or Amazon too well, but I think the width and availability of services that Azure has is pretty awesome, especially if you combine it with Office 365.
There is now a question from Stefan Bierer. He asked, which SQL solution would you choose on Azure if you started today?
Yeah, I would still go with, we used Azure SQL. I would still go with Azure SQL again, because that is their cloud native, basically, version of SQL Server. And SQL Server itself or even managed SQL is really only if you need 100% compatibility with basically the vintage SQL Server. We have some apps that need SQL Server, and for those, Azure SQL unfortunately wasn't enough. So that if you're in that situation, you don't really have a choice. They do have Cosmo DB as a more of a JSON document DB. We've tried that out with the workflow system that we're trying to introduce. Unfortunately, the compatibility wasn't good or the drivers weren't ready, so we also had to switch back to Azure SQL for that. But I think for some situations, if you really want a super scalable distributed database, Cosmo DB could be quite cool. But for us, at least for most tasks, maybe not the right solution.
Okay, so there are no other questions. So I should say thank you very much, Remy, and we leave you out again and switch back to Zurich. So, bye.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so that was it with the Tech Talk Thursday. Thank you very much for watching. And if you have any suggestions for us to improve, let us know. And if you like the talk, please click the like button. And if you like our talks in general, please subscribe down below. And that was it for today. See you next time. Bye.